Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank you and the entire committee for taking this issue up. I know this committee has done a lot of really great work this session, and you've had a lot of important issues to address, so I'm especially grateful that you're able to work this in. This legislation is kind of an example of some of the good things that can come out of our door-to-door work that we do in our districts. I have for at least 10 years known a young man who was involved in a scout troop that I'm involved with who has some kind of an esophageal disorder or a food allergy that makes it so that he can't eat anything at all. The only way that he gets his nutrition is through a bag. And it looks like a typical medical bag hanging on an IV pole, although usually it's hanging from his father's arm at different times on camping trips and so forth. And I was always struck by how well balanced this young man was and how well he got by in society. And in spite of the fact that, as you all know, I mean, we eat as a means of socialization and so forth. I've known him for years and years, but never did it come up in conversation with that family how they paid for the elemental formulas, these amino acid-based elemental formulas that he takes in through a feeding tube in his stomach. And then back in 2012, I was going through one of my door-to-door efforts. I ran into a family who you'll hear from shortly. Mrs. Harris mentioned to me, asked if I had any awareness of elemental formulas and how they're paid for with insurance. And I said, no, I really didn't. And she gave me an education and told me how, and I already knew that there's a lot of children that need these formulas to survive, but what I didn't know was that insurance companies weren't always covering the cost. And I'm sure we'll hear a little bit later on about the cost. It's extremely expensive for families to cover the cost of these elemental formulas. And what surprised me was the children that have these disorders can either take these elemental formulas through a feeding tube or they can take them orally. And another thing that I did know was that children with this disorder or these disorders will gradually over time try different foods. They conduct somewhat risky experiments. They'll try, let's see if we can eat cantaloupe. And if that works out okay, then they can continue eating cantaloupe. But it's a very slow, very gradual process to find out what foods they can and what foods they can't eat. And what Mrs. Harris explained to me, and we'll hear more about it, is that in cases where a child is taking these elemental formulas orally instead of through a feeding tube, insurance companies would say, well, we don't have to cover that because we only cover it if it's administered by a feeding tube. And if you think about what that encourages a family to do, that encourages them to go and have an invasive medical procedure performed so that they can get the cost covered if that's the only way they're going to be able to cover it. Another reason why insurance companies might not cover the cost of these formulas is if the child can eat something else. Maybe they can eat cantaloupe. They say, well, they have other options, other things that they can eat. But it's not realistic to expect them to only eat the few things that have been identified as those things that don't trigger an allergic reaction. So she expressed to me a need for someone to introduce a bill. And I said, you don't have someone to sponsor that bill? I'll be happy to do it. So as soon as we came back after, at the beginning of this session, I introduced House Bill 49. House Bill 49 was a standalone bill that simply said that an insurance company will cover amino acid-based elemental formulas for children with esophageal disorders, and it listed a couple of other disorders, whether or not they're receiving these formulas orally or by a feeding tube. And as long as the doctor says it's medically necessary, the insurance company should cover it. This was a standalone act. Now I'm going to go back to my comment about going door to door. So I'm out going door to door again, and I ran into another family who asked me what I knew about something called PKU. And I didn't know anything about it. So I said, well, let me look into it and get back to you. And I came back and I did some research and found out, well, how about that? We already have a bill, or we already have a law in place that says that insurance companies have to cover amino acid-based elemental formulas for children with PKU. And don't ask me to pronounce what PKU, I mean, it's a very long word, but it's another food-based allergy or disorder that prevents people or children from eating a lot of different things. And so they have to take these amino acid-based formulas. And so we have a law in place that already says the insurance companies have to cover that. So we found that it was very easy to then take that law and modify it and add esophageal disorders and other food-based disorders, just to broaden language so that we don't have people falling through the cracks because their disease doesn't happen to be the exact one that's enumerated in state law. So that's the genesis of House Bill 1436, which is the one that I'm hoping you'll be willing to advance to the House floor sometime in the near future. And I really don't want to get into too much more detail than that. I can't explain this nearly as well as the families can. And well, I will say, after the hearing today, if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to track me down on the House floor or in my office. I'll be happy to do the research and find out anything that you need to know. Again, I just want to emphasize, all we're doing is we're going to take, the beauty of this is we're taking an existing law and simply tweaking it so that children with esophageal disorders don't fall through the cracks and end up not having insurance coverage for something that's very expensive for the family and trivial. The cost for the insurance companies is trivial. So thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your willingness to hear this subject and consider it for a vote.